Hi, friends. We're back with American Miscellany, and we're now working on essay number 158, which is called The Croton Aqueduct, New York. I feel like that's kind of going to be pretty boring as a subject. This is American Miscellany, and miscellaneous covers all this stuff too, aqueducts and all. So I thought during this potentially boring essay, we could have a beautiful view of some lovely crocuses popping open this early spring day. So let's enjoy it. Again, this book is American Miscellany, published in 1865. Our previous essay, essay number 157, was entitled Youth and Age. This one, 158, is called The Croton Aqueduct, New York. We are here on page 411 of American Miscellany. The Croton Aqueduct, New York. On the 14th of October, 1842, the city of New York held Holy Day. And well it might, for on that day, for the first time since its foundation, did its inhabitants enjoy the blessings of a cheap, copious, and permanent supply of pure water. Hitherto, that essential requisite to existence was obtained from the pumps and draw-wells. Now it flowed through the streets in the form of a fresh and sparkling river, spread out into extensive lakes, gushed forth in every square and park, and disseminated itself into living rills of health and comfort to the remotest alley. The accomplishment of such a purpose was, in truth, a triumph worthy of a civilized people, a feat more glorious and enduring than the squandering of 10 times the amount of capital in gunpowder and bayonets. Amen to that. Those who are accustomed to sneer at the utilitarianism of the age may regard the watering of a city as a mere ordinary incident, a fit enough topic for the newspapers and small talk of a week, and nothing more. But to the individual who can take an enlarged view of human progression, and who knows how much of public health, comfort, and prosperity depends upon a plentiful supply of pure water, it will appear in its true light as a great national achievement. In such a light was the completion of the Croton Aqueduct regarded by the citizen of New York. And viewing it through the same medium, we proceed to lay before our readers some account of this magnificent undertaking. Like most modern cities which have rapidly increased in population and importance, New York, so early as the end of the last century, began to feel the necessity of a plentiful supply of pure and wholesome water. As with most modern improvements, too, depending upon the consent of the many, there was a world of preliminary palaver and delay. In 1774, when the population amounted to only 22,000, and the necessity began to be felt, in 1799, it was the subject of much talk, and even the consultations with engineers. And again, in 1822, after a lapse of 20 years, a committee sat upon the subject, obtained a survey, drew up a report, and had the same approval of. Still, however, nothing was done. The inhabitants of New York continued to drink impregnated waters when they could obtain them. When they could not, it is humorously supposed that they betook themselves to a gin sling. In 1824, the yellow fever committed fearful ravages, being all the more severe that the inhabitants had not the indispensable element of cleanliness to abate its effects. This aroused the authorities to a keener sense of the importance of water. Hence, 1825 and 1826 are remarkable for the number of speeches, reports, prospectuses, etc., which the water question gave birth to. Still, there was no actual movement. In 1831, a new committee talked of more decided steps and besought the municipal authorities no longer to satisfy themselves with speeches, reports, and surveys, but actually to raise the means and strike the spade into the ground. These, it must be confessed, were bold words, but they brought no water. However, a more urgent monitor now appeared, and in 1832 the plague of cholera ravaged the filthy and unwatered city. This so stirred the inhabitants and authorities to a sense of their danger that the latter now set about in absolute earnest to remedy the defect. Surveys and reports were executed anew, and after a few more last words and deliberations, the work was commenced in reality. In May 1837, the spade was struck into the ground. In July 1842, the waters of the Croton traversed the aqueduct, and in October of the same year were distributed throughout the city of New York, whose inhabitants hailed the event with unrestrained enthusiasm and joy. How this result was accomplished, at what cost, and with what success, we shall now endeavor to describe. The modes of supplying modern cities with water are either by means of artesian wells, by pipes which conduct and distribute some distant spring, or by the engine pump applied to the water of some river, if luckily such a source be available. The aqueduct, on its ancient and gigantic scale, is rarely, if ever, resorted to, and herein consists the novelty and interest of this mode adopted by the city of New York. An aqueduct, in its primitive sense, means simply a water leader, a familiar instance of which is afforded in the common mill course. The water is diverted from its natural channel at the requisite height, and then led along in an artificial course to the point desired. Now, this artificial channel may simply be a ditch, or it may be constructed of a solid masonry. It may be open or covered. It may wind along the sides of hills so as to preserve the proper level, or it may be carried straight forward through the hills and across valleys. The ancient aqueducts of Rome were generally constructed upon the latter principle, being carried through the heights by tunnels and across valleys and rivers upon arches. The arched portion of the structure originally giving the name of the aqueduct, just as the range of bridges which carry a railway across a valley is called a viaduct. The ancient principle was that adopted by New York. The Croton River is dammed up near its source. Its pure and undefiled waters are conveyed in a channel of solid masonry through hills by tunnels, and over rivers and valleys by arches or embankments, and after a course of 40 miles, administers to the health and comfort of 400,000 human beings. The reasons for adopting this species of structure are obvious. An open canal would have been liable to receive the innumerable impurities from the wash of the country. A closed one not only prevents waste by evaporation and preserves cleanliness, but adds to strength and durability of the structure. The inequalities of the country between the source of the Croton and the city of New York were such as entirely to preclude the idea of a plain or continuous water course, and the question to be decided was whether the laying of the pipes or the construction of an aqueduct after the plan of the ancients would be more economical, efficient, and permanent. After due consideration, it was decided in favor of the latter. Beginning with the Croton River, its sources are principally in the country of Putnam, at a distance of 50 miles from New York. They are mostly springs, which in that elevated and uneven country have formed many ponds and lakes, never failing in their supply. There are about 20 of these lakes, which constitute the sources of the Croton River, and the aggregate of their surface areas is about 3,800 acres. From these sources to the mouth of the Croton at the head of Tappan Bay in the Hudson, the distance is about 25 miles. The country bordering upon the Croton is generally elevated and uneven, not sustaining a dense population, and cleared sufficiently to prevent injury to the water from a decayed vegetable matter. The river has a rapid descent and flows over a bed of gravel and masses of broken rock. From these advantages, there is a good reason to suppose that the water will receive very little impurity from the wash of the country through which it flows, and there is no doubt that the sources furnish that which is peculiarly adapted to all the purposes of a large city. The water is of such uncommon purity that in earlier days the Indians gave a name to the river which signified clear water. Again, as to the flow of the water into the Croton, the capacity of the fountain reservoir, the discharge of the aqueduct, and the sufficiency of supply, we are presented with the following details. The medium flow of the water in the Croton, where the fountain reservoir is formed, exceeds 50 millions of gallons in 24 hours. And the minimum flow after a long continued drought is about 27 millions of gallons in 24 hours. The dam on the Croton River is about 38 feet above the level, which was the place of the natural flow of water at that place. Which was the surface of the natural flow of water at that place, and sets the water back about 6 miles, forming the fountain reservoir, which covers an area of, how do I do that? Okay, so, all right, the dam on the Croton River is about 38 feet above the level, which was the surface of the natural flow of water at that place, and sets the water back about 6 miles, forming the fountain reservoir, which covers an area of about 400 acres. The country forming the valley of the river was such as to give bold shores to this reservoir generally, and in cases where there was a gentle slope or a level of the ground near the surface of the water, excavations were made so that the water should not be of less depth than 4.5 feet. The available capacity of this reservoir down to the level where the water would cease to flow off the aqueduct has been estimated at 600 millions of gallons. Could we suppose that the Croton River will ever, in any season of drought, fail to furnish a supply greater than would be carried off from this reservoir and the reservoirs at the city by evaporation, we still have a supply of water which would be sufficient for 1 million of inhabitants during the space of 30 days, estimating the amount necessary for each inhabitant to be 20 gallons for every 24 hours. But we may assume the number of inhabitants at present to be 1/3 of a million, and therefore we have a sufficient store of water in this fountain reservoir to supply them for the space of 90 days in the emergency before supposed. In addition to the quantity of the fountain reservoir, we have sufficient in the reservoirs of the city to supply 1/3 of 1 million at inhabitants for about 25 days, at the rate of supply before mentioned. Thus we find, should such a supply as we have supposed ever happen to the supply from, thus we find, should such a limit as we have supposed ever happen to the supply from the river, the season of drought cannot certainly be supposed to continue during the length of that time, about 4 months, that would be required for the present population of the city to exhaust the quantity in store when all the reservoirs are full. The minimum flow of water in the river where the dam is constructed has been stated to be 27 millions of gallons for every 24 hours. This would be a sufficient supply for 1 million of inhabitants, and should the population of the city increase to 1.5 millions, this supply, together with the quantity in store, will probably be sufficient during any season of drought. There is, therefore, no fear in regard to the supply for the present. 161 years ago. And should the time arrive when the city will require, possibly 161 years in the future, should the time arrive when the city will require more than the present facilities afford during low stages of the river, other streams may be found which can be turned into the upper branches of the Croton or into the aqueduct along its course. Other reservoirs may also be constructed further up the Croton to draw from in seasons of drought. Such are the wonderful capabilities of what may be termed the feeders of the Croton Aqueduct, which is calculated to discharge no less than 60 millions of gallons in 24 hours. Some idea of this magnificent supply may be formed from the fact that the daily consumption of the principal London water companies, excuse me, some idea of this magnificent supply may be formed from the fact that the daily consumption of the principal London water companies, 8 in number, amounts to only 21 millions of gallons. Of the architectural structure of the Croton Aqueduct, it would be impossible to convey any clear idea without the aid of sections and diagrams. A general sketch of the undertaking may, however, be presented. As already stated, the fountain reservoir covers about 400 acres and is formed by a dam 38 feet in height, thus creating a source 166 feet higher than the city of New York. At this dam are sluices or gates for regulating the discharge of water and, of course, under the superintendence of a competent manager. The interior of the aqueduct is throughout of an arched or elliptical form, founded upon hydraulic concrete, built of squared stones. In crossing flats slightly below the intended level, it is raised upon solid embankments. In crossing valleys or rivers, it is supported upon arches. And in passing through hills, these are tunneled to admit masonwork of the aqueduct. Roads and other thoroughfares are, of course, left unobstructed by the erection. Oh, roads. Roads. Oh my goodness. Should I start again? I don't know. We're halfway through. Let's not. Roads and other thoroughfares are, of course, left unobstructed by the erection of bridges, just as they are when a railway is laid down. As the magnificence of aqueducts depends upon the height and number of arches requisite to carry them across valleys, it may give some idea of that under consideration when it is stated that Harlem River is crossed by 15 arches, 7 of which are 50 feet span, and 8 of 80 feet, the greatest height being 150 feet from the foundation to the top of the masonwork. This, it is true, is the chef d'oeuvre of the aqueduct, but there are other bridges and embankments of no mean magnitude, the design and construction of which do credit to American engineering. No essential change occurs in the form of the channelway from the fountain reservoir on the Croton to the receiving reservoir on the island of New York, a distance of 38 miles, except in crossing Harlem River to reach the island, and in passing a deep valley on the island, where the iron pipes are used instead of masonry to provide for the pressure consequent upon a depression from the regular plain. Thus, the source of the artificial stream may be said to combine two principles, that of the ancient aqueduct and a descent and ascent as in ordinary pipes. Should it ever be resolved on to remove the tubes from these depressions and to substitute arcades to maintain the regular inclination of the channelway, a second tier of arches will be required in crossing the Harlem River, and a bridge of great elevation to span the ravine of the island. Having by the means described reached the receiving reservoir at the rate of 1.5 miles an hour, the surface level of the water is still 119 feet above the level of mean tide. From this it is conducted, a distance of 2 miles, to the distributing reservoir, where the surface height falls to 115 feet. this last being the height to which the water can be made available in the city. The receiving reservoir covers about 30 acres and contains 1 month's supply, while the distributing, which is entirely built of stone, is 436 feet square, 45 feet deep, and contains 20 millions of gallons. This last reservoir may be considered the termination of the Croton Aqueduct and is distant from the fountain reservoir 40.5 miles. The whole cost of the work was about $9 million, and adding to this the cost of pipes and arrangements for distributing the water in the city, it will make the total cost of supplying New York City with water $12 million. Commenting on the comforts and blessings of this supply of pure water, Mr. Tower remarks, "The time is not far distant when New York will regard it as a treasure which was cheaply purchased, and will proudly point to the noble work which she has achieved not only as an example of her munificence, but as an illustration of what art and science can accomplish. With cleanly streets and the public parks beautified, with the fountains which set forth cooling and refreshing vapors upon the air, the citizens will forget to leave the city during the warm months of summer, and the seashore, the mountain tops, and watering places will fancy their beauty has faded, since they cease to be visited. But health is no less promoted by the internal than by the external use of water, and it is to be hoped that but a short period will elapse before free baths will be provided at the public expense for the use of the poor, as well as the public generally." This is a great idea, by the way. I think that is fantastic. Free baths. "Daily ablution should be regarded as necessary as daily food or sleep. The lime contained in the previous well water rendered it inapplicable to the purpose of brewing, tanning, washing, bleaching, and many other processes in the arts of domestic economy, and we believe the calculation would not be found extravagant if we would say that by the use of the Croton water, over 100,000 would be saved to the inhabitants of New York in soap and soda, and an equal amount in tea and coffee. To this may be added the superior cleanliness of the streets, the diminution of danger from fires, and the consequent reduction of the rates of insurance, the improvement of the public health, and the consequent saving in medicine and physicians' fees, the increase of working days, and the extension of the average period of working ability among the laboring classes." Fantastic. "And lastly, the moral and intellectual advancement of the entire population, attendant upon the improvement of their physical condition, each of which is not an unimportant item in the aggregate of the public prosperity and happiness. The value, however, of an abundant supply of pure water to the city of New York is not to be estimated by dollars and cents. If it were, it could be easily shown that it has not been purchased at too dear a rate, even were the expenses attending it increased to double the actual amount. Several of the public squares of New York are already adorned with beautiful fountains, mentioned by Mr. Tower as among the blessings which would result from the completion of this aqueduct. Some of them throw the water 100 feet perpendicularly, not after being raised by machinery, but by the force of the natural head alone." Super hot.